Hello, my name's Graham Fuller. I'm the New York film editor of culturetrip.com. The Cohen media channel has asked me to talk about some films made by some of the lesser well-known British directors of the post-war period. You know, people talk about Carol Reed and Michael Powell and Hitchcock as the great British directors, but I think it's unfair to call people like Terence Young, Val Guest and Lewis Gilbert journeymen, as they often are. These were highly accomplished technicians, and between them they made an array of highly interesting films. I'm going to start with Corridor of Mirrors, directed by Terence Young. This is a peculiarly baroque British film made in 1948. It was written by and stars Adina Romney, who was a stage actress who eventually became a hostess famous for her 12th night parties in Hollywood, and the great Eric Portman, who these days is probably best known for A Canterbury Tale, the Michael Powell film about rural England during World War II. Romney plays a married woman living in the West Country with her husband and her 3 children. She seems dissatisfied at the beginning of the film, and she soon announces to us that she's going to London to see her lover. It sounds a little sordid, but it couldn't be less so actually. Her lover, as it transpires, is a deceased murderer who is now a waxwork in Madame Tussauds, and she does indeed go to visit him, which starts a flashback to the time when she first met the real man. Portman's character was an artist and art critic, fabulously wealthy, who is obsessed with the past and indeed wishes that he had lived in the past. He draws into his orbit Adina Romney's character, who is a spoiled socialite slumming around London's nightclubs. He entrances her with his fabulous collection of clothes that he keeps at his opulent mansion. As their friendship grows, it's more of a friendship than a love affair, she models for him, and indeed he fetishizes her in costumes of the past. Look out for Barbara Mullen in this film as a strange woman living in Portman's house. Barbara Mullen eventually became famous as the housekeeper in the long-running British television series Dr. Finlay's Casebook. Adina Romney was a very sensual, very beautiful actress, and she and Portman are well matched in this film. Typical for Portman, he plays a faintly neurotic man who is, I say faintly neurotic, he's borderline crazy really. He wants something he can't possibly have. It isn't exactly Romney that he wants, it's the passion he has for being able to dwell in the past. Terence Young designed this film as an incredibly rich-looking, almost Edgar Allan Poe-like Gothic. I have no doubt that it influenced Roger Corman's Gothic Poe films in the 60s. It was quite like anything ever seen before in the staid British cinema of the 40s. Terence Young films the Venetian party with great sweeping camera moves. It really is a surprising work of art. Young went on to direct some of the James Bond films, for which he's better known, but Corridor of Mirrors is a rare gem, an exotic British Gothic that is unlike anything else made in Britain at that time. Espresso Bongo and Jigsaw were 2 films made by Val Guest that couldn't be more unlike each other. Espresso Bongo is a theatrical satire which is set in the espresso bar world of London Soho. I'm sure it was an influence on Absolute Beginners, the 1986 musical. Lawrence Harvey is quite brilliant as a huckster, an agent who is looking for talent with which to make his career. He has a stripper girlfriend, valiantly played by Sylvia Sims, whom desires to have a career as a singer, but her boyfriend Harvey completely ignores this and instead lights upon a young bongo player and singer played by the then sensational British star Cliff Richards. Harvey's character pushes this young boy into live performances around Soho, and gradually his star begins to take off. Now, Val Guest was married to American actress Yolande Donlan, a very underrated and very versatile actress, and in Espresso Bongo she plays a singing star who is having a little bit of trouble in her career, and she begins to compete with Laurence Harvey for Cliff Richard's talent. She wants him to join her show when she goes back to America, and so it becomes a tug of war between these two slightly corrupt older people for the soul of a callow young British musician. It shows how the British music industry manipulates young talent and exploits it. What's remarkable about it is that both Laurence Harvey, who's very, very funny in this film with his endless stream of Jewish witticisms, is sympathetic, and so is Yolande Donlan's character. These are people who are working the showbiz world the only way they know, with guile, with cunning, and without much kindness to people. Although Yolande Donlan uses her charms on Cliff Richard a little more effectively than Laurence Harvey. Nonetheless, they're both exploiting him. The film is far from sentimental, and it's a rather harsh look at the British music industry, but it's tremendous fun, and the song and dance numbers are terrific. And who knew that Laurence Harvey would become such a terrific presence in a musical? Jigsaw, also directed by Val Guest, is a completely different kettle of fish. This film was shot in the British seaside resort Brighton and nearby Saltdean, and I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a neo-realistic film. It certainly, however, was influenced by the British New Wave that emerged in the late 50s. Jigsaw is a police procedural. It's drum tight. It's a beautiful script written by Guest, wastes not a single word. A woman is shown in her house at the beginning of the film, appealing to her lover to stay with her, but he very quickly murders her. The woman was played by Moira Redmond, and she's very effective in a very brief role. The film then follows the investigation led by Jack Warner, who was a British musical star who had become a top British movie actor and acts with great authority in the role of a slightly disgruntled police inspector. Yolande Donlan, Val Guest's wife, plays a totally different character here than she did in Espresso Bongo. She is one of the women in the investigation who the police travel to London to visit, and her character, far from being a flamboyant singer, is a modest woman who believes herself very plain, the kind of woman that the murderer, who is very clearly a psychopath, would not be interested in, although she did encounter him on a train journey and was nearly tempted into his lair. Jigsaw is probably the best depiction of Brighton on screen, certainly since 1948's Brighton Rock. It has the tang of fish and chips in the air. It has the side of Brighton which is not always the flashy resort town, and the trailer park in Saltdean seems a rather grim affair. And this film is beautifully directed in that respect, and beautifully art directed. It's the Brighton I know of my youth, and it gives and Guest gives a very compelling backdrop to this very harsh and brutal murder story. It's a first-rate thriller, a first-rate police procedural. Val Guest was at the height of his career in the early 60s. He'd made two Quatermass films in the 1950s, which had attracted a great deal of attention, and he would go on and work for Hammer Studios, Hammer Horror. He directed films like When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. He was an excellent director, not a great stylist perhaps, but one typical of certain British directors of the era who were incredibly competent. Jigsaw is a film that rewards several viewings as it unfurls its intricacies and its picture of people at the end of their tether. I thoroughly recommend it. During the 1950s, a spate of prisoner of war films came out in Britain, the most famous of which was The Wooden Horse. In many ways it was a cycle that climaxed with the big Hollywood production in 1963, The Great Escape. One of the lesser known films is Albert R.N., directed by Lewis Gilbert in 1954. This is a smaller film. It's very claustrophobic and very superbly directed by Gilbert, who would later go on to direct several James Bond films. As it starts, a young American soldier is brought into a prisoner of war camp in northern Germany, where mostly naval officers are interned. One of the officers, Ainsworth, played by Anthony Steele, has devised a novel means of escaping the camp. He fabricates the body of a soldier who is dressed in a captain's uniform, and when the unit goes outside the camp under escort for its weekly baths in a bathhouse, they reassemble the parts of the dummy inside the building, and one of the soldiers remains behind. They fool the German guards when they carry the dummy back in an upright position back into the camp. This is based on a true incident at the Marlag O POW camp in northern Germany. This ruse of creating a dummy that could be carried out of the camp in parts and then escorted back in, looking like a real man, was attempted twice. Although John Worsley's design for the dummy was said to be perfect, it didn't work. I'm not going to say what happens in the film. You have to watch it, but this is a very authentic look at how this ruse might have paid off. One of the great aspects of Albert R.N. is that it shows the desperation of the interned Allied soldiers. A young Texan whose arrival at the camp starts the film is so desperate to get out that he risks his life. Particularly poignant is the story of a British soldier whose wife is a wren working in the canteen in Portsmouth, and he hasn't seen her for years, and he greatly misses her. And when the Texan talks about his conquest of a woman in a similar circumstance, the husband who's missing his wife becomes paranoid and suspects that the Texan is her lover. It's a really unusual prisoner of war film, and I think apart from the issue of the novel means of escape, I think it's worth focusing on how it depicts the lives of these soldiers living under the Germans in captivity. It does it very, very well, and of course it also points, as I said before, to The Great Escape. Lewis Gilbert went on to direct several James Bond films, and later in his career 2 films and plays by Willie Russell, Educating Rita and Shirley Valentine. He's a director whose work is worthy of reappraisal, and I think you'll enjoy these films. From the Quad Cinema in Manhattan, I'm Graham Fuller from culturetrip.com and the Cohen Media channel. Thank you.